We're going to move from the focus of the article portion of the worksheet to the variables section, so we'll skip ahead a little bit. I organized the worksheet in the order the information is included in the articles, but the textbook talks about the topics in a little different order, and I decided to follow the sequence of the textbook while we're initially learning about the concepts. I called this segment Variables in Real Studies because reading about it in the textbook can make it seem a little bit more simple than it really is in real life, and at the same time, it makes it more complicated, which seems contradictory, but I hope it makes a little sense, especially by the time we get through this process. As you might remember from the resources about variables, a variable can be any event, situation, behavior, or individual characteristic that has at least two values. In research, we talk about each variable in two ways. Sometimes we talk about more general labels that fit with the conceptual or construct definition, and other times we talk about the specific way the variable is defined for the research, also known as the operational definition. And generally, the introduction and discussion sections are more likely to use the conceptual label, and the method and the results sections are more likely to refer to the operational definition. That means we can usually identify the general variables when we determine the focus of the article. We also want to note the operational definition, though, to understand what the authors mean when they use those labels. The heading for this section of the worksheet helps you remember what information we will, ideally, include for each of the three different types of variables. If a study includes a measured variable that isn't self-report or physiological, we'll record as much information as we think is necessary to prompt our memory later. At this point, you might be wondering why we would want to note or copy all of the details I include in the worksheet. There are three reasons. One reason is because we're looking at examples of the different types of operational definitions, and looking at those details not only helps illustrate the differences between the general categories of self-report, physiological, behavioral, manipulated, but also demonstrates the range of ways those types of variables are actually included in the research. The operational definitions help us understand what the authors really mean when they talk about the variables, so we know if they're talking about what we think they're talking about. If there's a citation, it also lets us know that there's been a lot of work done to make sure that variable or that measure is reliable and valid. So the citation signals it's a credible measure. The other reason we make note of these details is because the notes can help us later when we design a study. If we wanted to study a variable that was also included in another study, we can go back and see how they operationalized it. If it was a self-report measure, having the citation in our worksheet notes can help us see if we can use the measure for our study. If you haven't already done so, please pause this recording to open your files for the Burton and King article, the PDF of the article itself, and the Word file with the worksheet. I highlighted the variables in the Burton and King study when we identified the focus, in part to help us start thinking about how the different parts of the worksheet relate to one another. When you're looking at your notes about the focus of the study, it's helpful to know that the focus is usually talking about at least two things: the variables in a study and what influences the value of the variable. We just have to figure out which parts are what they think will vary and which parts are describing how they will vary. Burton and King make it a little trickier by talking about the different levels of the variables and using slightly different wording in the goal sentence compared to the prediction. If we think about the wording and what they appear to be interested in, though, we get the idea that they're interested in three variables: writing, mood, and health. We can start our notes in the variables and operational definition section of the worksheet by adding those simple conceptual labels. Then, we look for the operational definitions to know specifically how they defined each variable. We know what we're looking for information about writing, mood, and health. Knowing about APA style also helps us know where to look. The information about the operational definitions should be in the methods section. Skimming the section, the first variable we see is mood. We can use the highlighted information to summarize the operational definition. Your notes on the article summary template should have at least the information included in the example in this slide. Note that the summary template includes a note about recording the citation if it's available. This is an example of where a citation isn't included, so we can assume the authors developed the measure for this study. We still have two more variables, so we'll continue skimming the method section. In the procedure section, we find the first mention of the writing manipulation, where we learn that they operationalized it in terms of writing for 20 minutes a day for 3 consecutive days. The header writing instructions below the procedures signals we'll find more information about the operational definition of writing. The explanation actually started a little before that, though, in the procedure section, as I noted in the last slide. I hope that the phrases participants read the following instructions and experimental condition helped signal that the writing variable was manipulated. For the article summary, we can summarize the operational definition like I have in this slide. We know that health was the other variable of interest. If we keep reading, we can find the operational definition for that variable in the last paragraph of the writings instruction section, although it doesn't really fit with that heading. We can use the highlighted information to summarize the operational definition. This slide includes an example of what this section of the worksheet might look like. Notice I added whether the variable was measured or manipulated along with the general variable name. That'll help when I think about the research design later. The information about the mood measure doesn't include all of the information we hope to have for a self-report measure because the article didn't include it at all. There wasn't a citation. The information about the alpha is the reliability and validity information. Notice, too, that a lot of the information I just copied and pasted from the article, but I edited and formatted it to make it easier to understand when I look at the notes later. If you haven't already done so, make sure to add your notes to the corresponding sections of the article summary template before moving on. If it seems tricky to determine if a variable was manipulated, you might try asking yourself two questions. First, did the researchers influence what participants did or when they did it? If not, it's not a manipulated variable. If they did, we need to ask whether the researchers had different groups of participants do different things. If they did, it would fit the characteristics of a manipulated variable, otherwise known as an independent variable. If they had all the participants do the same thing, there would only be one value of that variable, so it wouldn't actually be a variable in the study. It'd be a control or context. For example, one of the studies you might summarize for one of the activities focuses on the relationship between stress, social support, and health. They operationalize health by exposing all participants to a virus and measuring the level of infection. Since all participants are exposed to the same level of the virus, it's not a study variable. The Hurst example is an example of a very different type of operational definition. If you haven't already opened the Hurst article and worksheet, please pause this recording and do that before moving on. When we start by looking at the focus of the article, we see another variation on how they talk about the variables. In this case, they focused on what they plan to do and why. We can identify the variables by asking ourselves what they thought would vary. The phrase, synthesize the qualitative research, is what they plan to do. The phrase, in order to justify, signals that they're talking about why they're going to do it. When we ask, what did they think will vary, we might note the word trends, which suggests change. Since change suggests different values, and they use the word in reference to college student stressors, we can tentatively say that college student stressors is a variable in the study. The other part of the purpose that we haven't accounted for is cognitive appraisals of stressors. Since they refer to cognitive appraisals to explain why they're looking at college student stressors, though, they don't seem to be influencing the variations or interested in the variations, so it doesn't seem to be a variable, but it might be. So I'm going to make a note to look for more information to decide for sure. The Hurst article is a little different because it's an analysis of other studies. We're still looking for the same information, though, an explanation of how they define the variable. In other words, how did they determine whether an article included information about the variable or variables? In APA style, information about how the variables are defined is usually in the method section, so we can start looking there. That section doesn't have the usual subsections we're used to, but if we start skimming, we get an idea that the section does describe how the authors define the variable. First, they mention the years they included, so we know what time frame they used to define it. They mention the databases and search terms, but since that's more of a general step, I didn't include it in my notes. Doesn't hurt though if you want to include it in yours. If we keep skimming, we find the phrase to be included in the current study, which helps signal that they're starting to explain the specific details they used to define whether an article was about college student stressors. That paragraph explains the criteria and how they determined reliability among the coders. In other words, it explains what researchers looked at to decide if an article was about college student stress, and how frequently 2 or more coders agreed that an article was about stress. This is a good example of situations where it's more helpful to note the main ideas from the method rather than copying and pasting everything. For example, it's less important to include specific notes about why articles were excluded. That said, you might have noticed I didn't mention finding anything about how they defined cognitive appraisal. They didn't mention that in the method, so it wasn't a variable, and it shouldn't be included in the notes about variables and operational definitions. Now that you've learned about the process and seen my model, use the PDF file of the Hearst article to complete the variables section of that worksheet. Then look at Schifrin and Nelson. It's a quantitative article, so you can use the strategies we learned about for Burton and King for that worksheet. As we mentioned when we looked at the focus of the article, Schifrin and Nelson were interested in 2 variables, stress and happiness. If we weren't sure if the variables were measured or manipulated, the headings in the measures section helped us check our thinking. Then, the description of the measures included all of the information we hoped to find. You might notice that I moved the citation right after the name of the measure. I did that because of 2 pieces of information I would need if I wanted to find more information about the measure, so it helps to have them back to back in my notes. I also reformatted the information, so it was more of a list rather than a narrative to make it easier to see it in the details. One of the reasons I selected the 3 articles we're using for example activities is because they represent a few important ideas about variables. One of those ideas is that starting with the purpose hypothesis and the other information about the author's purpose helps us know what we're looking for in the method. That's helpful because the information about the variables can be presented in several different ways. Authors don't always present measures consistently within an article, let alone across articles, so it's helpful to skim the entire method section. These articles also provide examples of different approaches to operational definitions, from a simple 1 questionnaire measure to a qualitative analysis, from a manipulated variable to a combination of 3 questionnaires for 1 variable. They also presented examples of the minimum amount of information that should be included about an operational definition, and of what we hope to see in the ideal.